Hello, everyone watching and listening. Welcome back to the Free Radical podcast. This is your host, Swami Padmanabha. I'm here today again, this time with a very special guest, a dear friend in the journey, dear brother Alberto Varona. So, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was very nice to be asked.
Thank you so much. I look forward to this conversation. So, I'll share a few words of short bio of Brother Alberto for those who would like to know a little bit more about him. Brother Alberto Varona is a devout member of the community of Francis and Clare. In 2009, he received a doctorate in clinical psychology, specializing in psychoanalysis, attachment theory, and religion. Subsequently, he specialized in evolutionary psychology and the psychology of religion. In 2022, he received a Master of Divinity degree from Catholic Theological Union. From 2000 till 2017, he was a practitioner of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. From 2009 till 2023, he taught graduate and undergraduate psychology at various institutions of higher learning. He now works as the director of campus ministry at Saint Xavier University in Chicago, where he lives with his husband, the Reverend Jason Elliott, and their son, Nico. So before we start our conversation, those who would like to get in touch with Alberto eventually, I'm sharing here his email. For those who are only listening, it's aebarona at gmail.com. So generally, I like to start, Alberto, reminding myself mainly how we first contacted with each other. Maybe you have a way better memory than myself. Maybe you can help me reminding me about it. But it was a few years ago.
It was several years ago,
Yeah.
and I think it was in the context of something that you were doing with Sri Chaitanya Sangha at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I heard about you, and I was always very interested in collaborations that Swami Tripurari was doing with different people. I really enjoyed seeing those kinds of collaborations, and that's how I heard of you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in terms of when our first contact was, I have a feeling that it had to do with a book that you were presenting and the ideas related to inherent versus inherited.
Yeah, I think
Um,
so as well. Yeah, probably. Yeah.
I was very interested in that and those ideas to begin with, and I had heard topics like that be discussed for years and years, and it was very relevant also to what I was thinking about in Christianity too.
Hmm. Interesting. I think then eventually we got even more in contact when I started writing my second book, Radical Personalism. I remember we had very nice exchanges. You even did share with me some suggestions that I somehow or other tried to incorporate in the content. And in that context also, I think last year we arranged for you to make a presentation on male power seeking, control and deception in Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Yeah.
That was an interesting one as well. Yeah. So here we are. Yeah. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, no, just
Oh,
that
okay.
it was interesting to be asked to do a talk. I had never talked about those kinds of things before, but I was very interested in the topic. So
Yeah, and it was. I really appreciated the presentation. I really appreciated it. Very challenging, and that's why probably I appreciated it in terms of inviting us to challenging in terms of inviting us to think, as challenging as that is in itself, right? So
yeah, and I'm guessing that you're also male identified, and so when we talk about males in this kind of way, I'm sure it
mm,
is particularly challenging for a male to hear
mm,
things like that. So
yeah. Yeah, I will say, of course, I'm male identified, although I will say that I feel myself quite feminine in my personality and like have
mm,
lots of feminine side. And I know that for a sannyas, which is have been historically tied with a very male like stance, even how it's supposed, so to say, to be represented in society and the mood of the presentation and the I know that I'm kind of a not I don't know if what black sheep, but some type of weird specimen in between that order. But yeah, nonetheless, I will say that your presentation have enough healthy dose of challenge, even for myself. So yeah, I can imagine.
and for myself too, when I hear
Mm,
myself speaking about the way I do about males often, And
Mm,
the problem of males in humanity, I
mm,
sometimes forget that I'm kind of included in that, and that
mm,
I'm talking about things that, at least partially are going to pertain to me, even if I'm a little
mm.
kind of gender, variant in some ways. I'm still otherwise still
Yeah,
fit within that category. So,
yeah, totally, totally. So, Alberto, I think we could do it in Spanish, but our podcast is in English. But I always enjoy talking in Spanish with you as we did. But I've had recently and for the last years, but especially this year, last year, as you know, some meetings with other Franciscan brothers and sisters like Father Richard Rohr, like Elia Delio. So you are now coming to the table also as well. So for me, that's a pleasure. I mean, to have interfaith dialogue is always for me. I don't know. It's a healthy challenge to how I'm not only how can I empathize and connect to your own tradition, but how I'm understanding my tradition from the lenses of other traditions. And for me, it's such a healthy exercise to keep me, I don't know, humble and open to disclosure and not so sure of everything and
mm.
embracing a healthy dose of mystery. I don't know how it is for you or and what brought you today to this conversation in that connection.
Well, I love that. I love exactly what you're saying. The idea that intersecting with other ideas and other views, kind of, if we're going to take those views seriously at all, then it forces us to kind of stand outside of our own typical frame of reference in order to kind of see truth and value. And all of a sudden, we realize that truth, especially truth about a person like God, if we can say, refer to God as a person, especially when it comes to the topic of God, a healthy dose of mystery is very useful. And in fact, wherever I hear a lack of that in religion is where I start to become a little bit more skeptical.
Mm,
Whenever I start to hear people be overly certain about what we're talking about, um, then I start to feel skeptical. But I love that way that intersecting ideas causes us to, think more deeply, more broadly, um, more nuanced ways about God, because the topic warrants that, in
mhm.
my opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I,
Mhm.
I really I really appreciate that. Now the other thing about that is, and this has been kind of the torment of being me for the last few decades, is that it also leaves you kind of a little unsettled all the time, because there is a comfort in knowing, like, this is what I believe. This
Mm,
is only what I believe.
mhm.
This is the truth about who God is,
Yeah.
and this is not. And there's something really kind of comforting about that kind of certainty, that we long for it, I think, as humans, to be certain about something.
Hmm.
But I just don't think that that truth, the God truth, is going to ever really shouldn't really be like that anyway.
Hmm. Yeah, it reminds me recently reading Harry Nouwen, the beloved, you are the beloved of the Lord, and he will say, in terms of certainty and uncertainty, he will say, he will speak, as you may know, very famously emphasize so much, you are the beloved of the Lord, and God's unconditional love is a given. And he will say, that's the only certainty. No, so that's the only certainty, God's unconditional love. Everything else is uncertain. No, so I like to think of that in terms of what you say. Even in relationship with the divine, there is lots of uncertainty, and there should in a healthy way. But we should also cling, since we need certainty. Okay, we have this certainty. He loves us unconditionally. He has accepted us fully. And if we embrace that properly, everything else can be uncertain as it is, and it's okay, no. But if we don't embrace that unique certainty, uh, even if everything else will be in theory certain, it's not enough, so to say, no. So but I don't know, that came to my mind, but I really appreciate what you mentioned in terms of, yeah, not being so sure about uh, all that the divine is, because again, it's a contradiction of terms to say, okay, let's talk about the infinite, and I will present the complete conclusive statements about the unlimited and the infinite, which there is unlimited potential. And when there is unlimited potential, there's unlimited uncertainty, because potential is unknown. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting. I love Henry Nouwen, by the way. I've had a period of time where all I wanted to do was read Henry Nouwen, but he himself had his own struggle with
Yeah.
certainty that he is beloved of God, and
Yeah.
so even that is a hard thing to kind of reach, the sense that we feel, that we could feel certain that we are beloved of God. But I do agree that if we get there, so many other things become more trivial while still remaining interesting. Like, we could still talk about so many other things about
Mhm.
God and about church and about faith and such, and still find it very interesting. But it doesn't have to carry so much weight if we kind of feel some confidence that we are in relationship to God anyway, and that cannot be easily broken,
Mm.
right?
Yeah. Thank you for that articulation, because somehow it explains or depicts my experience during the last, I would say, year and a half, where I personally feel I've really entered way more than ever into this place of I'm unconditionally loved and accepted by Krishna, and being there and experiencing there and allowing that to happen with all the healing, and seeing, as you mentioned, this shift from how many other topics and conversations do not become, as you say, I won't talk about this anymore, but they do not hold the same weight because some new depth and weight have entered into the picture, and everything else becomes not relativized, but I will feel put in its own place in the context of this main aspect of God's unconditional love. So that has been kind
Mhm.
of my experience, and you just put it in words. So I wanted just to acknowledge that and thank you for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's sometimes people really want to kind of get to a certain truth so much that they're kind of willing to bully themselves and to bully other people into kind of lining up with the ideas that they want, but then they
Mm,
find the same ideas quite dissatisfying for themselves, because
mm,
the mystery of what we're talking about is quite vast. And there's a book that I haven't read myself, but I heard was quite good. Is that Your God is Too Small, or something like that? I don't know if you've heard of that. But anyways, it's the idea of how our own kind of theological work and philosophical work in trying to pin down God, you
mhm,
know, also just kind of renders him very, very, or renders God very, very small. Even using him, right? Like, already renders him,
mhm, mhm,
smaller than he would otherwise be. So.
mhm. Yeah.
But to feel beloved, right? To feel beloved of God is complicated also by the fact that psychology gets involved in all this too. So, I know that there were some tough circumstances in your life recently, and then we all have had tough circumstances even before, from our
Mhm,
whole life and childhood. And feeling beloved is actually quite a gift.
mhm,
Also,
mhm,
I spend a lot of my time at my ministry just helping people who come to a lot of Roman Catholic people who were raised with a more kind of spin forward kind of form of Christianity, a very kind of moralizing kind of Christianity that's kind of
mm,
dampens people's spirit quite a bit, I find.
mm,
To just help them get even a hint of what faith would be like if it was grounded in belovedness, right?
mm. Yeah. Yeah. I personally agree. How much more? I mean, we talked about this. You are developed of God, and it may sound even like cliche or like just pressing a button and I'm there. But as you say, it can be a struggle, and it's a gift in its own way, and it's a struggle in its own way. And at the same time, it's so foundational. I mean, we really need to connect with that in one way or another, and it's so difficult, as you mentioned, because also there's so much carried unresolved human issues and shame issues and unworthiness complex, and again, meritocracy, and I have to deserve, so once that happens, God may like me, and by
Mhm.
extension, we live in a society where you have to perform in a certain level, so you are part of, so we can extend that pattern everywhere. So it's not
Mhm.
as it's good. I appreciate that you mentioned that it's not as simple as it may sound in just saying you are the beloved of God, but nonetheless, it's worthy
Yeah. And
pursuing.
actually, and if we follow, most mystical traditions, including Gaudiya Vaishnava mystical traditions and Christian mystical traditions, the thread of belovedness is the thread we want to pick up.
Hmm.
We want to kind of find a way to it, and we want to pick it up. And we want to cultivate that because love is not only, the beginning of it, it's the end of it. And the entire process is a cultivation of it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, in a sense, it's like a beginning step to realize belovedness for the kind of spiritual journey to kind of unfold and deepen into all the rich layers that seem to be possible in relationship to God. If we take these spiritual traditions seriously and what
Mm-hmm.
they say is possible for God, if we
Mm-hmm.
take that seriously, all of them are cultivations of these threads of love.
Yeah. Alberto, since you touch upon Gaudiya Vaishnavism and mystical Christianity, of course, both Gaudiya Vaishnavism as well as Christianity can be related with less than mystical representations, but both of us
Yes.
yeah, but both of us also, yes, know that both of these traditions are ultimately deeply mystical and deeply
Yeah.
beyond the misrepresentation that we sometimes see, or we may even misrepresent ourselves, unfortunately, sometimes. So we were thinking about talking a little bit on this in this connection, for example, about the idea of actual spirituality and institutional religion. No, and what's the relationship between them in connection to a religion being mainly portrayed as one or deeply experienced as the other, so to say. So I don't know if you have any thoughts in that connection.
Well, I mean, I've had lots of thoughts for many years about that connection because I don't feel like we could ever really disconnect those things from each other. We're talking about like religion and structured, maybe even sometimes institutionalized religion, and then the spirituality that probably originated it.
Mm-hmm.
In most cases, probably originated it. And I think that those things are kind of both essential, which then makes me wonder why does one tend to go so badly and the other one you know, um, be such a challenge, right? Because spirituality can be quite a challenge,
Mm-hmm.
and the institutional churches or structures are really, when best intended, they're best intended to kind of bolster and support people in their spiritual aspirations and journeys, right?
Yeah.
So, so I think that, it's essential that we have it, and then religion gets swept up into so many other things, and so fast it gets swept up into so many other things.
Hmm.
You structure it for the sake of kind of helping people, but then before long you're quite addicted to the structures, right? And that
Hmm.
becomes, and where you wanted to kind of lift people up and lift people up and beyond, right? You end up instead kind of squelching them, and that happens across many different traditions. So you know um so I think I don't know, I just think a lot about kind of a healthy kind of relationship between those two things would be essential, but we're not quite sure what that is yet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, uh, so if we think about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, for example, if we think about the ways in which the ecstasies of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu were, kind of harnessed within this lineage of teachers, right? And then how Bhaktisiddhanta then really kind of institutionalized it more, maybe Bhaktivinoda, and then Bhaktisiddhanta kind of institutionalized it a little bit, and A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, of course, really institutionalizing it in a very significant way that was very successful.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the failure that was the byproduct, I think, of the success. So
Mm.
you're trying to really kind of capture something, but you're trying to, what's that saying? They say trying to capture the wind in, I don't know. There's some kind of saying like that, in American English, but you're trying to capture something mystical within an institution, and that's what's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, and in Christianity, of course, this was historical too. I don't know. I'm sure you probably know some of the ways in which kind of the more spiritual, mystical lines of Christianity, ended up getting institutionalized very strongly,
Mm.
especially around the time of the Emperor Constantine,
Yeah.
and how institutional Roman religion really kind of um, uh, anyway, seems to have had an effect on the kind of the freedom of spirit and the power and force of the spiritualities that were going on outside in what they call the desert communities, right? And desert mothers and fathers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an oversimplification because there was also probably a need for institutional religion at the time, but nevertheless, it did have some negative effects as well.
Today in the morning, we were talking. I was giving a lecture today. We were celebrating in our tradition the appearance of the deity of Radharaman, this famous deity in Vrindavan, which is said to be self-manifest. And we were talking in connection to Gopal Bhatta Goswami, who actually was appointed by Sri Chaitanya as the main initiating guru, and how maybe one of the main reasons was his prestigious background, high birth, like very high bloodline, spiritually speaking, being the son of the main priest at one of the main temples in India. The point was like how Sri Chaitanya also employed power, because influence, position, prestigious birth at that time in society, all that translates into the word power, and how he considered power not as something bad, and as you were saying also, structure, institutionalization is not necessarily something bad. The point is, I would say probably that you don't lose the sense of purpose. No? Like, what's the purpose of this? What's the purpose of an institution? What's the purpose of power? And generally, I will say one of the main maladies of our time is a lack of purpose and meaning. No, like a lack of awareness of the purpose and meaning of whatever we are doing, even when we are practicing spirituality. So the vigilance and the awareness, I will say, to keep clearly, to be present to the actual purpose of whatever, in this case, institution and structure, could serve well and better the.
Yeah, and if we were to take very seriously, I'm sorry, were you still saying something?
No, just please.
If we were to take very seriously the monitoring of what the institutional traditions are doing, right? If part of the structure was to say that we have a continuous reevaluation, or kind of at least a conversation about, are we still, is anything we're doing squelching the spirituality of the people that we're meant to be supporting, rather than, of course, supporting and uplifting them and encouraging them along their journey, then maybe we need to rapidly reassess that, whatever that is, whether that's a policy or whether that's just kind of a, the way we're worshiping in the morning or the time that we're worshiping. Because, as soon as the tradition loses sight of the kinds of, spiritualities or spiritual experiences that they are meant to help people cultivate, then they have lost their purpose and they become religions turned on themselves, turned into themselves, right? A church that's doing church for themselves, for who they see inside of the walls, and um, so I think that's really important, that we really be honest with ourselves about how something is working or not working in our institutional religions, right?
Yeah, totally agree with this sense of fluidity, so to say, and elasticity in terms of pay attention to the fruits that are coming, and conceptualizing the structure as something relative, in the sense of it may need to take some further shape, and every single generation or member of the tradition, at least how I will conceive this idea of parampara, is not only you are to honor your ancestors, so to say, but you are also to be attentive to what needs to be sometimes even unlearned, to allow a bigger learning, or deconstructed or dismantled, in order to have a died sometime, in order to have a new birth to whatever conception or structure or presentation, and whatever is the need to honor faith properly, ultimately. Like, because at the end of the day, we are all here servants of the principle of faith. And so I will say, in my opinion, if you are a committed servant of faith, you will be willing to do whatever it takes to for faith to continue being nourished, in myself and in other cases, right? So
And looking for the fruit is a good way of saying it. And Jesus himself said that, that we look for the good fruit. And in spirituality, of course, that makes perfect sense, right? It's not that we're kind of neurotically looking for only kind of positive fruits all the time, that we become obsessed with, avoiding any kind of pitfalls or moments of discouragement, or, your practice, ebbs in our lives. But we should really be looking for fruit. And if we're seeing a consistent pattern of of our practice or our institutional way of kind of coming together and worship not bearing fruit, then we should take that very, very seriously. I will say about parampara, since you mentioned parampara, is that the idea is, of course, to make sure that there's kind of a live wire,
Yeah.
in the world of that spirituality, and somebody who could use their kind of observation and rational mind to kind of adapt things as necessary in order to preserve the kind of the use of this spiritual live wire. But every generation still resists the change anyways too.
Yeah.
Every generation's still like, well, yeah, but we still want to. And that
Mm.
could be a useful tension because you preserve what still is. It forces you to think about, well, what is essential then. Okay, if we're going to change things, and what is still essential to our line, and make sure that that happens. So, a little stubbornness could be useful. Too much stubbornness leads to all that kind of stuff you hear all the time about, imagined golden eras when things were great. And, you know, you have
Yeah.
that in Gaudiya Vaishnavism with, oh, if only things were like when,
Yeah.
Prabhupada was still here. And it's like, there was all kinds of stuff going on when Prabhupada was still here.
Mhm.
And, in Christianity also, if we could only go back to then, in my church is the Episcopal Church. Boy, we could go back to how things were in the 1950s when the churches were overfilled and we had 3 Eucharist services every week. It's like, what are you talking about?
Mhm.
There
Yeah.
is no, I mean, maybe there were golden eras, but they mostly end up being kind of really myths that we
Yeah.
long for something old.
Yeah. Yeah. And generally, I would say that this toxic sense of nostalgia overlooks, as you say, the shortcomings that were happening at that particular so-called golden era, and just highlighting the apps, which nice to highlight the apps, but also to be humbled by the downcoming, so to say, because if not, yeah, it makes a totally decontextualized picture of what actually happened. And and that's an avoidance not only of the present but even of the past. So that's showing out how you
Yeah.
are being evasive in all the directions basically.
Yeah, I love that you use the word nostalgia because I'm a bit of a nostalgia junkie. I'm always thinking back to, oh, I remember in
Mm,
my 20s when I was so free. And
okay.
if you're really honest with yourself, you look back and like, wait, things weren't great back then. I was always longing for something different then too. It's almost like um, i- it's almost like an avoidance of the reality of the present moment, right? Always kind of clinging to a future possibility or a past, you
Yeah.
know, myth for the
Yeah.
sake of avoiding the present moment and what it actually is offering you right now. I'm reading a book right now that's all about like letting your contemplative practice give you access to the present moment so that you could mine it for its depths of kind of spiritual power, right? That if you
Mhm.
were to really realize the depth of present experience and present awareness, how powerfully, um, I mean, endlessly deep that could be for one, instead of always clinging to like reaching for the past and the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very, very striking.
Yeah, yeah. These days, interestingly, yesterday we were talking last night with a few friends here about that. Absolutely, that specific point of being present. As again, as cliche as this line may sound, be here now, so to say. That's so contemplative and so crucial and so foundational. Because I was talking with a sister some weeks ago, and she was like, "Sometimes I'm praying, Krishna, where are you? Where are you?" And we concluded saying, well, he's omnipresent, so to say. So he's here, right now, always. So the question is not so much where are you or where I am, where am I, right?
Where are
Because
you? Yeah.
he's omnipresent. So if I cannot perceive someone who is omnipresent, it's probably I am omni-absent. That's a contemporary. We coined that new term these days.
Omni absent. Who came up with that? Who came up with that term?
Yeah, you can use it in your sermons. I give you permission. No copyrights attached. But yeah, if someone is omnipresent and I cannot perceive his omnipresence, it must mean I'm omni-absent. And again, it's connected to this idea of how the mind tends to go shopping, so to say, past, future, but avoiding presence. Because of
Yeah.
course, present moment means confrontation with what needs to be confronted, and that's maybe scary sometimes, and maybe challenging, but that's the only place we can have a real epiphany or any real experience, only in the present tense, and that's where God resides, so
Yeah.
to say, for in his openness to us. So
Well, that's certainly the wisdom of the traditions that most kind of influence me and inform me. The wisdom of those traditions is almost always some version of this, right? The idea that um, in the present moment, in the present experience with God, is where you could actually, find your kind of your gold mine, right? Your spiritual gold mine, right? And
Yeah.
even the practice, the sadhana of Gaudiya Vaishnavism with the japa, the idea is to keep you present right now with the
Mhm.
holy name of God, which
Mhm.
already inherently possesses all the qualities you wish to kind of unfold into your own spiritual life,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
so the idea, instead of the sadhana of japa, where you are kind of all over the place with your mind and you're just kind of fumbling out words, at an inaudible pace with your mind all over the place. No, but
Mhm.
instead we have even one moment of access to Nam,
Yeah.
one moment where the holy name of God, in your tradition, let's say Krishna, or in my tradition, Yeshua or Jesus, right? The idea that the holy name shall possess qualities, if we could just open ourselves to even a brief moment of that, everything we would need would be there.
Yeah.
Now, this would, of course, depend on the truth of God's immanence, right? That God is actually that God is real, of course. That's kind of an easy presumption, more or less, for most of us. But that God is real, and that one of God's qualities is to be immanent and to be here with us all the time,
Mhm.
pervasively involved in our lives and in the world and in creation and such. And
Mhm.
so, if that's all true, then we should just try very hard to be omnipresent to God's omnipresence, rather than, what is the term again?
Me absent.
Omni absent.
Yeah, yesterday we celebrated here the appearance of Nrsimhadev, and yeah, he comes from a pillar, as you may know. So that for us is kind of immanence, the god of immanence. Some to say he's in every atom, technically, according to our philosophy. So if you have the eyes to see, if you have the love that will make him appear from that place, I mean, that will happen. But again, we have to have the presence, as you were mentioning, and I appreciated the point you made of chanting japa, because even sometimes practitioners of my tradition think of chanting more in terms of I have to focus and be attentive, but they take it more as a merit exercise, like by my own effort I will be able to focus and enter there, instead of more like a presence exercise. Like I try to be present and I need grace to be present, but I'll try to be, and it's about being present. And how
Mhm.
that's how the Srimad Bhagavatam began, no? With Parikshit Maharaj have 7 days to live, and he asked his guru Sukadev Goswami, have only 7 days, isn't that enough? And he said, just a moment of proper attention is
Mhm.
enough. For me, attention means presence, right? Just if you are present, everything is there in that particular moment. No? So, but a
Mhm.
whole life of not being present, of omni-absence, of distraction, may not be enough, so to say. No, by
Yeah.
contrast.
And the presence, of course, is still the book I'm reading right now is called Into the Silent Land by Martin Laird, and I really enjoy his writing. One of the metaphors he uses is that the contemplative practice is, in a sense, like, or the ability to kind of be present to God,
Mhm.
is like, at best, just kind of being like a ship with the sails ready for the wind. But you got to remember, always the wind is what's going to guide it. And you can't make the wind,
Mhm.
and all you could do is prepare yourself for the wind to carry you away. And it's like that with contemplative practice too, which is, you've got to be present. That really is, not required. That's really the condition that we find to be successful for most people who are on the spiritual journey.
Hmm.
But of course, the grace in Gaudiya Vaishnavism and Christianity, mystical theology, that is, the idea is still that the grace will come to us, and we open ourselves to it, and it carries us away,
Mhm.
right? And there's always a stage in one's practice where we have become receptive. Actually, we are now receptive to the movement of the grace, or the Shakti, or whatever we want to um, call that, where God is now acting in us,
Mhm.
and we just made ourselves available for that action. I think in Christianity, there, the Carmelites talk about that stage as when there's an influx,
Mhm.
when there's an influx, and you hear the same kind of thing in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, with the idea not of nishta but ruchi, right?
Mhm.
Where at the stage, all of a sudden, God begins to kind of kind of give you real taste
Yeah.
for love. And so this is a very important detail also, so that we don't become deluded that our practice is what makes things happen, as you were
Mhm.
pointing out with those devotees who sometimes think that
Mm.
if they just concentrate enough, they could drag Krishna down.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that reminded Shikshastakam Mahaprabhu. He's saying Shreya Kairava Chandrika Vitaranam Vidyavadu Jivanam. He refers to this influx like a particular rising of the moon and some moon rays descending upon us, and those moon rays compared to the descent of grace, right? So in that connection, Alberto, also just to shift gears slightly, I'm thinking in terms of grace and in terms of how grace may eventually take us to a particular um, specificity in our spiritual aspiration. I'd like to delve for a minute into the mystical theology of both Gaudiya Vaishnavism and Christianity, in
Mm.
particular, as you also suggested, a few words on the possibilities with God. So I know
Mm.
that, of course, there are different stances in Christianity about that. I've been talking even recently with some friends, and even some of them will tell me, and they are very serious practitioners that I admired. And I asked him, one of them, like in private, like, so if I may, I ask, can I ask you this question? Like, what's your ultimate conception of God, and how you imagine yourself, so to say, relating to Him in eternity, to Him, to her today, in terms of Trinitarian dynamics, whatever, is something specific that you're aspiring, or is more like a you don't know, you trust, you have full trust, and you are okay with that unknowing, so to say, that mystery. And in his case, he told me, to be honest, I mean, he gave a long answer, but at the end, he said, to be honest, yeah, I don't know. It's not
Yeah.
fully clear, but I'm okay. I'm okay with that, and I feel the call, and I feel the pulling of grace, and I trust that whatever has to unfold will unfold. So, but also, of course, I've heard different stances in connection to Christianity, different moods in different saints and different sections, like the Song of Songs and other
Yeah.
traditions. So, I'd like to know about your particular stance, if you have something to share in that connection.
I do. I have lots of, because this is one of my favorite topics, of course,
Mm,
in the and I will say that one of the reasons I can talk about this a little differently is because of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, because
yeah.
Gaudiya Vaishnavism, in my opinion, is kind of the crown jewel of, spiritual relationship
Mm,
theology,
mhm,
right? I think, and I always hold it up like that, and I always talk about it like that, despite the fact that I'm no longer, you know, I no longer consider myself a practitioner. It'll never cease to kind of just flood me with inspiration to think about things like the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and the idea of Rasa Tattva, and the idea that you have particular types of relationships you can cultivate with God. And these ideas are so profound and so
mhm,
special, even if a bit concrete in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, the way they end up being conceptualized, end up being very concrete, but
mhm,
nevertheless better than sometimes the very vague stuff you get in Christianity. So, anyways, but I'm informed by that. So when I came back to Christianity, I was
mm,
already informed by that, and I was already kind of the frame through which I was thinking about it was a kind of a Gaudiya frame, and so I
mhm,
was looking for evidence of the kinds of stuff I was hearing in Gaudiya Vaishnavism all the time, and all the years that I was involved in that. So, anyways, and you mentioned Franciscanism earlier, and there is something unique about Franciscan Christian spirituality, um, in that in Franciscan mystical experience. Well, if we look at Francis,
mhm,
if we look at Saint Francis developed, at least according to kind of legend and tradition, developed the stigmata.
mhm,
And the stigmata was, of course, the very marks of Jesus's wounds on his body,
mm.
not self-inflicted, but spontaneously granted in the body by God, allegedly, right? This is the thinking.
Stigmata, as they call sometimes, right?
To what?
The stigmata, as sometimes it is called.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
and the idea is a very profound one. I mean, some people are just weirded out by the whole thing, and certainly a very tough thing to aspire for, because it's obviously sounds gruesome. But if you think deeply about what we're saying there, we're saying that the love of Jesus Christ was so great in these people, that they identified wholeheartedly and somatically
Mm-hmm.
with him, to the extent that they were granted the wounds of him. So what we have there is a particular kind of relationship, and Gaudiya Vaishnavism talks almost nothing at all of anything like this, although in Hinduism it's not completely unknown
Mm-hmm.
generally. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that you would be like God, you would become God-like and identify with God. It would be a kind of a twinship or an identity type of,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, could we say rasa or something like that, where we get to really live vicariously him,
Yeah.
or
The term
vicariously.
the term that comes to my mind is a term that, of course, I've used recently, which is tadatmya,
Mm,
which somehow it implies like mystical empathy, that
mm,
you somehow like connect so much. It's like sameness. Like they give the example of the iron rod put into the fire, and
mm,
the iron rod
mhm.
becomes fire-like. So
Yeah, exactly.
that's
And
a
in
same yeah.
and in Christianity, right, the idea, what is a better cultivated idea is the idea of becoming divinized, um, sanctified, becoming more Christ-like,
Mm-hmm.
the path of divinization, right? The idea that we should become more and more God-like, in other words, like the rod in the fire, more and more God-like as we enter deeper and deeper into relationship with God. But
Mm-hmm.
as you pointed out, right, and so this is a unique Franciscan Christian contribution, although there is some reason to believe that maybe Paul, the Apostle Paul, who was Saul and then who became Paul, might have also had stigmata. He refers to how he bears the wounds of Christ, and we don't know if that just means that he was beaten for Christ and had scars or injuries, or if it literally meant something like stigmata.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, and we know dozens and dozens of people who have had
Yeah.
stigmata as part of their spiritual, you know, experience, a somatic spiritual experience. What I also value so greatly about Gaudiya Vaishnava mystical theology is the way they talk about somatic response to relationship with God, right? That Mahaprabhu would have horripilation and the sweating of blood. The idea that this stuff is embodied stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see that same thing happening in Francis. Now, in other parts of Christianity, you see other things related to like rasa tattva, or like different kinds of relationships to God. And you talk about Song of Songs, although I'm sure that for the Jewish people, that was very much uh, a love and sex manual,
Mm-hmm.
right? But for the Christian thinker, that becomes, an allegory for the love of God in a romantic vein. And while this is not often cultivated in Christianity the way it's so very powerfully cultivated in Gaudiya Vaishnava mystical theology, with the love of Radha and Krishna as the kind of the epitome of it, right, or the pinnacle of it. It is nevertheless very present in Christianity, with lots of concepts and lots of spiritual, such as Bride of Christ, and language that is very either directly sexual, like in St. John of the Cross,
Mm-hmm.
or kind of bride-like, meaning more kind of appropriate romantic kind of
Mm-hmm.
socially conventional relationships. But one way or the other, romantic feeling like stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you've got the very, very prominent idea of Jesus as brother friend.
Mm-hmm.
So the apostles had an experience of Jesus as Lord, teacher, rabbi, then became friend, but they were adopted by God. And that was the whole point, I believe, of Jesus referring to God as Father, is to say, if he's my father, my daddy, actually,
Abba,
you're
yeah, Abba is
my
daddy.
Abba, you're my dada. If he's my dada, he's your dada. And so we're all brothers and sisters and friends. And of course, Gaudiya Vaishnavas very much well know this idea of what it means to cultivate a relationship with God as brother friend. Right,
Mm-hmm.
this is a very common thing. I heard Swami Tripurari speak about that for many, many, many years in a very powerful way. So there are very overlapping ideas, and of course, God as magnificently God, awesome, full of power.
Yeah.
With analogies or sort of metaphors, or God images of king, God images of creator, and things like with majesty. These are also very common, but of course, like in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, considered less intimate.
Yeah, but nonetheless, we consider the possibility of relating to God in that powerful, opulent, majestic form.
Yeah.
That portal is there, although it may not be the main emphasis in our tradition. It's a clear possibility mentioned throughout the scriptures. So
Yeah, but so you asked a question. You said that you asked a question to your to the people that you had been interviewing. I think the Franciscan people or somebody you were saying, but Christians aren't used to thinking about things like this, right?
yeah.
They're not. I actually, even as much as I had studied religion for a long time before I joined Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and then became influenced by Swami Tripurari's very deep thinking about these things. Um, he also is the one who introduced me to the idea that many different religions' ultimate goals might be real. They
Mm-hmm.
all might simultaneously be real. How much he really believed this and had conviction in it, I don't know, but he did say it quite often
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
it is truly possible that in the spiritual world there are multiple valid possibilities, even across religions.
Yeah.
And so that the Gaudiya Vaishnava could truly have a real possibility with God as Krishna, and the Christian could really have true possibilities with God as Jesus. And while
Yeah.
each tradition may not agree with the other ones, that they all might still be real possibilities. That is very revolutionary because it doesn't just what am I trying to say? Make all spiritual aspirations generically the same.
Mm-hmm.
That's super unappealing to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. And it also
But it,
doesn't present triumphalism. Like there is only this one, and it's
exactly.
generally my one. So
That's right. So it neither makes spiritual goals generic, and it does not collapse into triumphalism, which is only
mhm,
my tradition has any kind of true possible
mhm,
spiritual outcome. I mean, frankly, we could all be wrong about all of this,
mm,
but maybe we all could be right too
mm, mm.
in specific ways.
Yeah. 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 Personally, at present, I like to emphasize this point of the non-dual foundation that reality shares, and how on that, if that non-dual foundation is properly established, as our own tradition presents, no, Advai Gyan Tattva says the Bhagavad, and reality is non-dual consciousness. So first, if you have those bricks, foundational bricks in place, we can, I will say, have a realistic conversation of the possibilities of, as you say, diversity, even in post-liberated life and different places and different realms. But
Yeah.
first, we have to have that foundation in place. That, yeah, our tradition will say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which basically means there's only one family, right? So it's, in other words, there's only one source, and all of us are revolving, constellating around this common center. So first we have to establish that, and then I will say there are way more possibilities if we are properly establishing non-dual thinking. Way more possibilities to deal with diversity successfully, and even in a tasteful way that can nourish each other's journey.
Well, whenever you hear of traditions that are kind of emphasizing non-dual reality,
Mm-hmm.
which is a thing that happens especially in kind of contemporary spiritual circles nowadays, it often also ends up collapsing into some form of spiritual impersonalism, which I don't have a problem with. I know that Gaudiya Vaishnava has a kind of a bit of a bone to pick with impersonal spiritual experience, but I don't have a bone to pick with it. But it also does not mean that just because there is a non-dual dimension to ultimate reality slash God, that would mean that all spiritual experiences must ultimately end there,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? That it is the ultimate reach of
Mm-hmm.
what spirituality can offer, therefore
Mm-hmm.
the best,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if it's the ultimate reach, then it must also be the best, and that all spiritual experiences will end up there anyways.
Yeah.
One of my favorite spiritual writers is a man named Bede Griffiths, who took
Mhm.
Christian. He
Yeah.
took Christian sannyas.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I love him. I, of course, unsurprisingly, love the intersection of India and Vedanta and Christianity in him. But he did the same thing. His faith was a very ended in a very kind of non-dual.
Dvaita. Yeah. Dvaita Vedanta. Yeah.
It ended up in an Advaita Vedanta kind of point,
Yeah.
which again I don't have a problem with unless you tell me that that's really the only thing that's possible
Mhm.
there.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's what every Christian's outcome is going to be anyways. It's a little condescending to also to all the efforts we make, let's say, to love Jesus or to love, you know, Krishna as a gopi. What's the point of all that if it's all going to end up in this thing? Then it's condescending to all of our aspirations too.
Hmm. Yeah, to clarify, when I'm emphasizing non-dual foundation, I'm not, of course, promoting just at the end of it all, it boils down, it's reductionistic and it becomes one in every single, not radical non-dualism, as I will call. I'm not
Yeah,
proposing that. I'm
yeah,
okay with that being an option, as you mentioned. I don't have a problem, although it's not my cup of tea, but I acknowledge that's an option. That's in the scripture. But by non-dual foundation, I mean, yeah, this common center that makes that there's not a second separate reality, so to say. I'm trying to overcome the illusion of separatedness when we see, okay, there is something called God and something called me, and this called. They are not like isolated realities, but everything is
that's right.
interconnected with this common center. By that, I mostly mean non-dual foundation.
Yeah.
And yes, but
Well,
I think
I know how you would approach it for
I'm
sure.
just
Yeah, yeah,
clarifying for our listeners and whomever is following.
yeah.
And also, Alberto, you have shared with me in this connection in terms of affinities in transcendence. If I may, I remember you mentioning you have some special affinity for Mahaprabhu. So,
Oh,
so how does play out?
I have a Gornitai deities in my office at work in my very, very Roman Catholic institution, and my supervisor is always a little surprised when she comes into my office and sees these. I
Hmm.
When I first encountered Gaudiya Vaishnavism, I was I think 19, something like that, and I'm turning 49 now, so it's been a long time.
Hmm.
So I have a very kind of deep and long relationship with Gaudiya Vaishnava, one that's very emotional, and I had a very, very profound experiences in my life as in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Um, but from once I figured out Mahaprabhu, because sometimes he could be kind of a hidden gem even within his movement.
Yeah, yeah,
But
agree.
once I discovered him, Chaitanya Charitamrita was for me kind of, and still is for me, one of the most profound um, texts, um, telling one of the most profound stories ever. And
Hmm.
for me, it was always really this idea of the ecstasies of Mahaprabhu, this very kind of embodied, unbelievable capacity of love of God that would, in a sense, take over and flood oneself and everyone around them. And
Hmm.
then this idea, as my former teacher used to say, that you then are going to try to, when we talk about institutional religion, you try to create a dam around it to see if we can kind of capture some of that ecstasy, right?
Yeah.
That's institutional religion, right? How can we kind of capture this? Because we want to capture as much. And then his ecstasies, which for me was just unbelievable. I had never heard of anything like that, only to find out then of all the very profound ways that his followers had tried to conceptualize it.
Hmm.
You had never heard ideas like the ideas that the Goswamis were able to kind of put down
Hmm.
as a way of trying to understand the ecstasies of Mahaprabhu. And
Hmm.
so for me, as you could probably hear in me, I just think there's just something so profound there. And while I don't aspire for the particulars of that anymore, I do think that there's something that's almost unheard of anywhere else in the world of spiritual experiences and ideas than what we saw in Mahaprabhu, Chaitanya Dev.
Hmm.
So, um, so yeah, that is always going to be very, very special for me. And if you ask me still, if I want to take a trip anywhere, where would it be? I would say I want to go to see, where Mahaprabhu was from, and visit the
Okay.
places of his. Yeah,
See you
yeah,
there
and
in Navadvip next time. Let's organize something. Some Catholic, some Christian friend of mine from New Jersey wants me to organize an interfaith pilgrimage to India. So
yeah,
let's see what form that takes. But I think that's
yeah,
a very interesting experience. Yeah.
yeah. I'm sure it's a very interesting experience. But anyway, so I'm not sure if that's what you were getting at with me in Mahaprabhu, because I just kind of went off on my enthusiasm there. But
Oh, please.
It just
Beautiful.
I just find him so inspirational. And then
Mhm.
what I did with that, when I came back to Christianity for many reasons, I never lost. I had a priest who said to me, "Well, you don't have to relinquish your relationship with your former teacher or your previous experiences and knowledge.
Mm.
Just kind of use all of that in fueling your love of God here."
Mm.
And I appreciated that. I'm not sure, I don't, rarely hear things like that, but I appreciated that because there's no way I was going to be able to anyways. And all the ways in which I now am informed, inform myself in Christianity and cultivate my contemplative life in Christianity is deeply informed by what I learned from my former teacher and from Gaudiya mystical theology, especially.
Yeah, I really appreciate, and I'm humbled by witnessing your capacity, or even your attempt and desire to not relinquish, to be grateful, to remain appreciative, and to be able to express, yeah, with love and emotion, what someone like Mahaprabhu makes you feel, without the need of, I mean, without that meaning anything, that you are not betraying your Christian faith, and you are not being, I don't know, ironic toward the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. I mean, for me, it doesn't mean nothing like that, but on the contrary, it shows like a very like ideal synthesis of how to deal with this unique dynamics that you have gone through. So I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing the the
Yeah.
testimony. That's what I brought the topic without maybe telling you in advance, but please tell me about your love for Mahaprabhu, because I knew something very interesting will come, and it did. So
I think
thank
people assume that because I love Mahaprabhu so much, that must mean I. So this is where that whole inherent kind of topic,
you.
and the
Mhm.
ways that that plays out in institutional religion really kind of has a kind of a bad savor in my mouth. Because when I decided that I wanted to come and go back to Christianity, or at least pull away from my Gaudiya Vaishnavism in terms of the aspiration for certain goals within that and the practice, and certainly with the involvement with the institutional religion for sure, I kept hearing things like, "Well, you'll come back. You're always going to be this,"
Mm,
and it's easy. It's a manipulation, really, and it's a
mm,
coercion
mm,
that condescends to tell me that I have no right to choose anything in my own spiritual aspiration journey. It
mhm,
also does something even slightly more. Um, Malevolent, which is to then try to steal away my enthusiasm by telling me that if I don't hold my enthusiasm in the right way, then I shouldn't even have it at all. And I
mm,
wanted to keep my enthusiasm for Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, my
mm.
conviction that he was um, who he seemed to have been, and still cultivate my own spirituality informed by that,
Yeah,
without having to follow his particular
yeah.
um, kind of a line. And I always found that very obnoxious. The people in that my tradition, in my group, would say
Mm,
to me, "Oh, you're going to come back once you're a Vaishnav. You're always a Vaishnav. Once Krishna's, given you experiences, or you've been initiated there." What I never said, I said this to you. What I never said to them was like, "Well, I was already initiated before all this too in Christianity."
mm, mm.
So, there's this belief that once you're initiated in a particular line, of course, that's kind of binds you spiritually, and that may be true actually. The question is, would a Gaudiya initiation trump a Christian initiation, or would a Christian initiation trump a Gaudiya initiation? And we don't know the answer to that because we never encountered this until recently.
Or even whether we need to talk about in terms of one's trumping on top of the other, basically, right?
Right. Could both of those kind of initiations actually permanently,
Hmm.
permanently convict and invest us with something
Yeah, and
that don't have to become a conflict? Yeah.
create a particular influence and presence in complementarity to the other. And I know, as you say, these are new conversations that we are starting to have
Mhm.
at this time. So even for some, they may sound heretical or completely, anyhow, these different
But
types of reactions may be there, as you are yourself mentioning, or
yeah.
just immediately eliciting defense mechanisms like that's not possible, and if you're doing that, anyhow,
But
those things.
back to our original conversation, right? A little
Mm,
spiritual humility is warranted, right? We don't really know, and
yeah.
we're really intersecting with new things here. The idea that there is Christian initiation, it's really one fold, but it's been divided into twofold. You've got your baptism, but you've also got confirmation and these other things. And anyways, but it's Christian initiation, right? That's what it is.
Mm,
It's even referred to as that.
mm,
And then you've got Gaudiya Vaishnava initiation, and it wasn't until recently
mhm,
where you had people who had both.
mhm,
Now,
mhm,
what does that mean? So this is now
mm,
mystical interspirituality. This
mhm.
is not just interreligious stuff. This is intermystical spirituality, and then it should be thought about.
Yeah.
It should be thought about. What happens, and when you've been, you know, kind of when a particular kind of grace or Shakti has been kind of invested in one,
Hmm.
and another one also, and how do those kind of cohabitate with each other in
Hmm.
a person's spiritual life and their soul?
Yeah, because it makes sense that, I don't know, in your case, you have been practicing Gaudiya Vaishnavism for decades, and now you are returning to your Christian baptism, so to say. But you cannot deny the influence of 20 years or more, of 30 years of, it will be like absurd to say no, all that influence and influx of a particular grace disappeared by my returning, or the opposite, the other way around, whatever the
Yeah.
tradition. But so in that sense, for me, it's way more realistic to acknowledge, no, I have been receiving these waves of grace in different directions, different influences. I cannot just like pretend that they are no longer there, they are not operative in any level, and now I'm in my new faith or my old faith return, whatever. But actually, as you say, open to, okay, how is the convergence of these, and are they coexisting, informing each other? How much I should even talk about two different things or
Yes.
different facets of the same
Yeah.
principle, so to say.
Well,
And
there's non-dual. There's the non-dual again, and the dual, right? The idea that maybe it is one thing, it is one God, one ultimate reality, and it is multiple threads of that
yeah, I'm
reality.
probably finding a new language to even talk about it, because if we
Probably,
have
yeah.
never talked about it, probably we don't even have the vocabulary and the
Well,
notions
I've
that.
never talked about it with anyone actually until you. These are the first times I've ever even said anything about
Mhm.
that. But it was very much my first remembered Christian experience, if you'll mystical experience, was in Christianity when I was a teenager. I wasn't raised religious. I was baptized as a baby and then not religious my whole life. And then at
Mhm.
15, I started going to a Christian church, a Southern Baptist church. It was very
Okay.
beautifully strange place, very homophobic place, but very
Yeah.
also inspired spiritually place. It was just a mix of all kinds of stuff, which basically was a foretaste of all my religious encounters. It's always a mixed bag of experiences for me. But it was in, singing hymns, so, Christian kirtan, in singing hymns that I would be flooded with spiritual emotion, and I knew regular emotion very well. This was a different kind of thing. It was a qualitatively different kind of emotion, and it was in Christianity. So when I came to Gaudiya Vaishnavism, encountered it at 19 and then joined at 23 and got initiated at 25, right?
Mm.
I had already come with all that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had already come with, baptism, rebaptism, Southern Baptists rebaptize people,
Mhm.
and then, which was very profound. And then enter into Gaudiya Vaishnavism with all the beautiful aesthetics and the powerful practices. And when I started having spiritual experiences in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, they were experiences that were added into my being, to the experiences that I had already had before.
Yeah.
And then, so I think that's just kind of an important, without having to conclude what all that stuff is that we were talking about, to just say that in my experience, they all have coexisted in my being, right?
Yeah. Yeah, at least to leave the door open, that that's a possibility. No, we are not just saying here, okay, everyone should have exactly the experience you are having, but at least to leave the door open for the conversation, let's say.
Mhm.
And I appreciated something you said a few minutes ago, when you mentioned that uh, you found renewed inspiration, let's say, in your Christian tradition. For some people from Gaudiya Vaishnavism, it was strange to see you inspired, because you are not supposed to be inspired after leaving the tradition, and you will return. And if you are inspired, that for some it may even like, that confirms that you are even wrong, more wrong than what I thought. Because how can you be inspired? If you are inspired, means like you are whatever, not grateful, different ideas. But I went through something similar myself, although I continue with the Gaudiya tradition, but in the connection of going to other groups or having to take a distance from some dynamics, and receiving infusion of faith and inspiration and grace. And for some people it's like, but you are not supposed to be feeling all those things, because according to my opinion you did this wrong and did this, so you should be suffering and being disconnected and being, but you're inspired. So and how that takes the human mind to try to justify the inspiration I cannot deny in that person and trying to craft it as something like the worst of the worst. Because if not, that confronts me like, okay, if you are inspired, it means that you are not so wrong as I thought, and probably I am wrong in how I'm judging you. And anyhow, just some
You know,
reflection again,
it, it
how we
it's
craft all the things in our mind.
it seems to me that it has at its root some kind of a psychology of what can I say, consumerism. Like, if you want to possess this, here's the way you possess it. But if you're not going to hold this in the way that you're supposed to hold it, you can't have it at all.
Mm,
Right?
mm,
You have no rights to this thing unless you deal with it the way that I expected you to deal with it. So if you're going to be inspired by Mahaprabhu, then you have to be inspired by Mahaprabhu in this way,
yeah.
right? In my way, according to my limits and my constraints.
Hmm.
Um, but isn't that so interesting that one should try to, how religions continues, and people, but people and religions tend to constantly try to delimit how God can act in us, and
Hmm.
how God is allowed to act in us. And then
Yeah.
they'll justify it by saying things like, well, it's not how what I think God should act in us, but how we have seen in the valid traditions that God does act in us, how God chooses to.
Mm,
Fine. I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to delegitimize the idea that God might act in predictable ways, and in patterned ways through history. I'm sure God does do that, but that God also does not have to act only in those limited ways. God can act in very interesting ways. My own spirituality is continuously one of kind of bridges.
mhm,
If I'm really honest, actually, it up until some years ago has always felt like my spirituality was always between. I was like I was neither there nor here, and I
mm,
lived nowhere until my spiritual director said, "Don't you realize that if you really look at what your spiritual impact and contribution to the world actually is that you're not in the gap between things. You seem to act as a bridge between things.
mhm,
You're connecting people and ideas all the time that are
mhm,
part of different banks,
mhm.
and you bring them together." And I thought, what a beautiful way to reframe. And thank God there's someone else who's listening and who cares to
Mm,
tell me that I'm not in the gap, but I'm
mhm.
more like a bridge. It's so beautiful.
Yeah. And again, as you mentioned, the power of articulation, because just a few words can change your whole way of seeing yourself, basically. Instead of seeing yourself as a limbo guy,
Yeah.
you are depicted as a bridger, so to say, no? And that's a completely
Hmm.
redeeming perspective, so to say.
Hmm.
So, and I can
Yeah.
identify with that so much, not to just to imitate or say that I'm doing what you are doing, but somehow I could see myself also in some type of eternal liminal space. But also at the same time, I'm when I hear the word bridge and integration, I feel so much. That's my call, so to say, no?
There you
And
have it. That's exactly what I was going to say. When you feel that inspiration, that there's a call in it for you.
mm-hmm,
And while that might isolate you from some people who wish to kind of stay on the one island, which
mm,
is not a bad thing to
mm.
do, but
It's their
but
call, yeah.
but it nevertheless may be that that's the call that you got, and that's just the call that you got, and that's just the way it is. So I really love when you say that you feel kind of the call to integration and integration and bringing people together. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's obvious, right? You got to meet the illustrious, Ilya Delio and um,
Yeah, Father
the
Richard and others. Yeah.
Father Richard Rohr, who in my circles is very very important.
Hmm.
Also, like Ilya Delio is as
Yeah,
well. So
yeah, yeah. Again, as you mentioned, I feel it's my call, and but it doesn't mean that it has to be everyone else's call, and that's when we have to learn to let go and identify with our call without imposing our call on others, but identifying enough as to take responsibility for our particular call that needs
mhm,
some identification, some focus, and some depth in that, but also in a way that that's not spilling over and like imposing up on others that have their own call. So yeah, that's a constant balance and creative tension, so to say,
you
right?
know. And if it is a call from God, right? If it is a call from God, then you
Mm,
have to follow it if you want to enter into intimate relationship with that same God.
Mm-hmm.
right? In a sense, it's like, well, this is what I would like.
Yeah.
And, maybe you'll say, well, sure, but can I have some input? And God will say, yeah, you could have some input, but nevertheless, we have to follow it to continue in relationship, right?
Yeah.
With, with this kind of ultimate reality
Yeah.
that is God.
Yeah. Alberto, you have also in the bio I read you have been connected with evolutionary psychology. And at present, I'm writing a book. I'm almost done. I have to write the conclusion chapter, and it will be a
Wow.
book on evolution, but evolution more from the context of love as ever evolving, as something that is in process, on the move of unfolding, and therefore God being love, being an ongoing processing himself, herself, so to say, not a fixed, static, changeless character, but someone who is impermanent uh, expansion, and therefore our potential as souls in connection with God and love being similarly ever evolving, and also matter, material energy in its own way, being also in movement, being not inanimate, not dead, but being alive in its own way. So, since you are an evolutionary psychologist, so I want to share those news with you, and also I invite you to share a few thoughts on how you will frame what I just share with you in your own words.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is process theology. I'm sure you've
Yeah,
heard that before.
Alfred
And
North Whitehead. Yeah,
well, the philosophical work of Alfred North Whitehead that gets picked up by
Hartson.
theologians.
What's his
Hmm?
name? Hartson, Charles Hartson. I'm pronouncing it correct.
Charles Hartshorne, and then several other people,
Yeah.
and they're kind of clustered. I think, and there's a large process theology movement at the Claremont colleges in California where they still
Mm.
teach this kind of theology. There are definitely other kinds of philosophies of God
Yeah.
that have picked up some threads of that and then taken it into new threads. But it's what comes to my mind because of the emphasis there on God not being a static being, but always being in a continuous process of
Mm.
transformation. And this comes from Alfred North Whitehead's, of course, thinking on all of these matters himself. He
Yeah.
himself did not have kind of strong, from what I can tell, strong theological convictions, although he did kind of get to the idea of the possibility of thinking of God in these kinds of ways. So I love that you're engaging those ideas from within Gaudiya Vaishnavism. It's very, very interesting to me.
Yeah.
For me, the idea of evolution came a little differently after many years of studying psychology, because when I was studying psychology, there was another devotee friend of mine, still a friend of mine, who was also a psychologist a couple of years ahead of me in psychology, who introduced me to psychoanalysis, which I value very deeply still, and was definitely very well formed in. But one of the things that happened for me as a psychologist is that that a lot of the things that we are observing, that people's problems that people struggle with, and understanding what the mind is, were
Mhm.
not really well answered. There was just a whole lot of mystery in understanding the mind, which of course there should be. It's complicated.
Mhm.
But I did realize at one point through attachment theory, which was not directly evolutionary psychology, but had embedded evolutionary principles in it.
Mm.
Um, but the minute you embedded some evolutionary principles into your thinking, things started to clear up.
Mhm.
Not to solve all mysteries,
Mm.
just to say
Mm.
that there's some clarity came by
Yeah.
simply having added the right kind of core ideas. So I'm
Mhm.
a real big fan of core ideas, or what we call meta theories, let's say,
Mm.
having a good meta theory of what reality is like, and then building our thoughts from that good core foundation. Reminds me, you sent me something recently about Teilhard de Chardin.
Mm.
Teilhard de Chardin, Jesuit, mystic and theologian,
Yeah.
was always looking for something solid on which to ground.
Yeah.
Descartes was also doing the same thing. Wanted something solid to ground his thinking in. Right? Conclusions aside, right? What do we find that's solid that we can ground our principles in our theological or psychological thinking?
Mhm.
Evolution became that for me,
Mhm.
a really kind of root way of kind of grounding my thinking about, in that case, the mind.
Mhm.
In religion, I think in religion, consciousness studies is where I think we're finding that now. I think that you might actually be a little kind of involved in that. Certainly, my former teacher was very deeply interested in consciousness studies
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
understand, because this philosophy, this area of philosophy, I think is, and science also, is very promising to us. The idea that you talked about, non-dual consciousness, or the idea that at the root of reality is consciousness,
Mhm.
and that everything is transformations of consciousness. Well, that's either right or it's not right.
Yeah.
Sounds right to me.
Mhm.
And I like the idea, and we're deeply trying to engage that now. And I think it's very yummy. I think it's a very yummy place to be right now, where spiritual people are really starting to think like,
Yeah.
okay, the root of reality in consciousness rather than in matter. But
Mm.
wait, matter acts a lot differently when you look at it at the finest level. When you look
Yeah.
deeper into matter, it no longer acts like what we think matter is. Oh, so what's that? And so we're
Mm.
starting to know so much more about ultimate reality now than we did before. Anyways, I'm far off, but I just want
Yeah, yeah. I was writing recently about how, yeah, for some people at one point was the hard problem of consciousness, like what consciousness is, but nowadays for many it's the hard problem of matter, because they thought they had figured out what matter is, but with, I don't know, things like quantum mechanics and who knows so many things, they're like, wait a minute, what's matter now? I mean, it's like completely different than what we thought, and it's moving and it's a vibration, and it's like has like a quality, a musical no tone to it. It's like dancing, it's like vibrating. Of course, in my particular religious lenses, I will say yes, because God is in every atom, and our God Krishna is a dancer, and he plays the flute. So every atom must be singing and dancing. Some blueprint must be there. But yeah, I
yeah,
totally agree with you about the how exciting are these particular times in terms of having this type of conversations we can have and address,
yeah,
even not only as from a particular perspective of psychology or even science, but even from a spiritualist point of recalibrating our own ideas, or even going back to our ancient texts and rediscovering them with the language of even contemporary disciplines like science or
yeah.
psychology. I mean, I think that bridging again is so crucial, so necessary to keep the tradition
Yeah,
relatable and relevant.
you can say that we're encountering, since you talked about hard problem, you say we're encountering the non-dual hard problem, which is
Mhm.
that the hard problem of consciousness and the hard problem of matter might actually be a similar hard problem, which is just trying to understand the nature of reality itself, and what constitutes, ultimate reality in general, right?
Mhm.
Even the studies of consciousness that talked about, how is it the human consciousness is possible? Is it something that just kind of comes to be when kind of the nervous system is so sophisticated and the structures are so well structured, and
Yeah.
you've got a kind of a self-reflective structure that combines to a core structure? This is all basically thinking of I forgot who I'm citing here, Damasio. Like the idea that like you've got a core structure, and then Antonio Damasio. You got a core structure, and then you got a self-reflective structure. You put those together, and mind comes to be, in the way we think about it. Consciousness is.
Hmm.
Or you've got the people who say it comes to be more and more complex as the mind and nervous system get more structured, but down to every single cell, there's mind in every single cell of reality.
Mhm.
That's called panpsychism,
Yeah.
right? No, no, that's right. That's called uh yeah, panpsychism, the
Yeah.
idea that there is mind in every
Mhm.
single, not even cell's too big, right? Every particle of reality has mind in it, and all you see in humans is this sophisticated kind of combination of it. And then God, and
Mm.
then God would be all things particle reality energy
Mm.
with mind in it, in
Mm.
one conglomerate consciousness. Right? All of a sudden, things start to sound like, oh, that kind of makes sense a little in some, super abstract way, but it makes sense a little.
Yeah. 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 It reminds me Srila Siddhar Maharaj's book, Subjective Evolution of Consciousness, that he talked about. It's a compilation of things he said like 50 years ago, but he will say things like matter is a densification of consciousness, of things
Mm.
like this, like you're like 50 years ago from Bengal, from the Bay of Bengal, things like it's like, okay, see you in 50 years, everyone will be talking in those terms somehow.
You should.
So
I'm glad that you mentioned him, because
hmm,
one of the greatest things that came to me from my former teacher, Swami Tripurari, who I still value very, very much, although I have virtually no contact with him at this point. But one of the greatest things that came from him, not accidentally, was my exposure to Srila Sridhar Maharaj. And
Mhm.
I remember one book in particular, Follow the Angels. I don't know if you
Mm.
know this one. I'm sure you know this
Yeah,
one, of
yeah,
course.
all of them. I read it again recently. Yeah.
I had just never heard anything like that.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
had never heard. So my encounter with Gaudiya Vaishnavism was like one kind of mind explosion after, or heart explosion, whatever you want to say, kind of mind heart explosion after another. As long as I was able to ignore a lot of the noise, and boy, was there a lot of noise.
Hmm.
But once I was able to kind of ignore a lot of the noise and just highlight all the kind of beautifully profound, expansive things I had learned, he was just one of them.
Mm.
I don't think, for me, I guess I could just draw a direct line, kind of a live wire from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to Srila Sridhar Maharaj, right? And
Mm.
I know there's very important people in between
Mm.
those two. I'm not saying there's not, but for me, it's like explosion one, explosion two in my mind,
Thanks so
and
much for making that highlight, because somehow it resembles what I experienced with my first teacher in the 1999. And fortunately, he was connected also with Srila Prabhupada and Srila Siddhar Maharaj, so I was introduced to the two of them like from day one. And for me, Srila Siddhar Maharaj was kind of a new reality altogether. I mean, Krishna consciousness was, again, as you mentioned, explosion one, no? Opening to that layer, and then in the language and poetry and philosophy and depth and sensitivity of Srila Siddhar Maharaj was like explosion two, three, four, five, six, and so on and so
yeah,
forth. So
yeah. And
yeah.
a lot of the things that I saw in my teacher,
Mm.
a lot of things that I saw in my teacher also, I think, were, kind of the reflected light on. I mean, he was, my
Yeah.
teacher is
Yeah.
a very profoundly
Hmm.
spiritual person. I've never doubted that one bit, but a lot of it was really the reflected light of Srila Sridhar Maharaj in him, I think. And that's not a criticism of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami at all. It's just to say that there was something particularly powerful and resonant in me about Srila Sridhar Maharaj's contribution, because wherever you saw his light shine, wherever it shone, if the object onto which it shone was receptive to that light, you
Mm.
would see it reflect, you
Hmm.
know, you know, so powerfully. Um, and the fruits that they bore were like him. Um, how can I say? Uh, Unpretentious and yet overwhelmingly powerful.
Hmm.
And the fruits that even his followers bore were very significant and very subdued.
Hmm.
They were rarely big.
Hmm.
So it was just an interesting kind of thing. So, anyways, I just really love that you mentioned him. He was, has always been so important
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah. To me as well. Thank you. Thank you for that. I have many topics in mind. Still, I'd like to share a few more thoughts if you have a few minutes. But of course, there are so many topics that we may not have time to talk, as like the parallel practices between Christian tradition and Gaudiya tradition, and japa and the Jesus prayer, and kirtan and hymnody, or the theology of the
So
holy name,
fun.
holy food, and yeah, prasad, or as you mentioned, Eucharist, and the worship, or darshan. I mean,
Yeah.
we may have to do a
Yeah.
few other episodes in the future because there's so
Yeah, holy food. We should talk about holy food though. But anyways, you do what you want with your podcast.
Please bring the holy food to the table. It's your turn.
That was very nice. That was very poetic. The one of the this is going to sound super I don't know, kind of basic of me to say, but um no one really has kind of asked me ever what drew me to Gaudiya Vaishnavism
Mm-hmm.
at first, and there could be many answers to that.
Hmm.
Um, but I want to talk about food.
Yeah.
I had become. Go ahead. Did you say something? Want to say
Oh,
something?
no, 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 no. I
Oh,
was just thinking about many of us are here because of that. So you can bring your testimony. Yeah.
so not accidental, right? So I am I am in line with other people.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
I had become a vegetarian 1 week before I met devotees at the Miami airport. In fact,
Mm,
I think that the devotees who were preaching at the time in the Miami airport, one of them became a friend of mine. His name was Tripurari Das.
mm,
He's a friend of mine. He's a religious studies scholar, no longer a
mm.
practitioner himself. But anyways, I had become a vegetarian that week, and he said, "Well, actually, there's a vegetarian restaurant in Miami. You should go to it." And I went to it,
Yeah.
and I wasn't sure I liked that food. I was like, "What is going on with this food? It tastes a little funny. What are these flavors?" I'm Cuban, so garlic and onion were my primary flavor.
Mm,
you know, uh, Forward flavors. Being a
mm,
Cuban, garlic and onion were the main flavors. And so I was tasting this food, thinking, "What the heck is this?" And then I left there after eating that food, and I thought, "God, I need to go back."
mm.
And I needed to go back, and I kept going back until the point where, of course, I loved that food, and almost never missed garlic and onions. And um, I had a very deep faith in, and then I discovered, of course, that there was a whole theology to it.
Mhm.
And I was very moved by this theology of holy food. Of course, all your listeners are most of your listeners are probably Gaudiya Vaishnavas who know, the theology of prasadam and the idea of God's remnants and leftovers and the graces of all that. But for Christians, that's all still relatively foreign, except for when you think about things like Eucharist.
Yeah.
Um, and so there
One
are,
parenthesis, Alberto, that just came to my mind for a minute before I forget. A parallel that I've made is sometimes Jesus talking in terms of a banquet or a feast, and not like depicting heaven and depicting eternity. And for me, it was a nice parallel with the idea of prasadam. In terms, prasadam also means grace. Not so it's not only the food. And sometimes Mahaprabhu will feed his followers a kanta or up to the neck. Um, Give more, give more. And for me, somehow the two of them can like interconnected in this idea of overabundance of grace, no, like
yeah.
symbolizing the food and up to the neck, and more and more. And Christ speaking about banquet and feast. I just want to mention that in this connection.
Yeah, and it's hard when you're taking me on a tangent that's going to really be exciting for me, so I'm going to try to resist it a little bit. The idea of the banquet or the feast in Christianity, which, the Eucharistic experience is supposed to be one of being kind of spiritually banqueted. You're
Hmm.
supposed to be being spiritually banqueted, but the symbols that they've selected now over the centuries for that is like this tiny little barely food wafer, and if you're lucky, a little sip of wine, and just doesn't tend to encourage a kind of a banquet experience, right?
Hmm.
And so, anyways, that's a favorite topic of mine. Get me started talking about bread and Eucharist, right? But anyway, so the idea, I developed a deep faith in the idea of spiritualized food.
Hmm.
Um, for me, the idea of Eucharist is not alien in any way. The idea that food can be both food and deeply spiritualized, and overflowing with special graces that we then take in.
Yeah.
How much more concretely delicious and profound can we say than to get all your spiritual graces, embed them in food so that we could take them deeply into ourselves and metabolize them? I
Hmm.
don't know. The layers of that are so profound. So I always had a deep faith in prasadam theology, food theology, and so that was a very, very meaningful thing. And I do believe that I was being kind of pulled forward through special kind of spiritual graces, in food. By the way,
Hmm.
there's also in Krishna's Leela a big important lots and lots of stories about food and feedings and things like that. So that this stuff goes on into eternity, like you said, with Christ, right, into the banquet feasts.
Hmm. Hmm.
But anyway, so the idea of spiritual food, in whatever tradition you find, is very important to me. For years, I always wanted to start a restaurant. It was all about like popular spiritual foods of the different religions, because each religion has them. But they're not all necessarily like these, like prasadam. I'm thinking here in particular about maha prasadam. That for your listeners will know that that means the actual leftovers that were offered on the shrine, right on the altar, to the actual manifestation of the god in the form, right?
Hmm.
And the idea of Eucharist, where the idea is there's some parallel there. I'm not saying they're the same because, I'm not like that, but the idea that this is food that is directly, infused with
Hmm.
massive mercy and grace,
Yeah.
that when consumed should be sufficient nourishment for the spiritual journey, which is demanding,
Hmm.
and we need to be fed for that journey. You know, so anyways, and so I just really enjoy the topic of food and
I can
the
see
way
it.
that.
Yeah, I can see you relishing. Talking about that, what to speak when you relish the food itself.
But
Yeah.
that's why fasting in Gaudiya Vaishnavism and in Christianity never really resonated with me. And I
Mm.
remember one Krishna Janmashtami years ago at New Dwarka in Los Angeles. The feast was late, and it was like 12:30, and and they said, "Would you like some fruit to break your fast?" And I was like, "The hell with your fruit! Just bring me the feast." But the fasting for me never resonated. I know that it's profoundly spiritual for a lot of people. There's no
Mhm,
doubt, and
mhm,
that's across many, many traditions. For me, it never resonated because I need the spiritual food for
mhm,
my spiritual journey,
mhm.
and so I find spiritual food to be far more powerful than refraining from it. Anyways, those are not necessarily connected things, but
Oh no, thanks for sharing. And we all love prasadam. That's a universal point, meeting point, non-dual foundation.
yeah, I remember when years ago when Hridayananda Maharaj was promoting more kind of westernized everything, right? Yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know how important that is to him anymore, but anyways, westernized everything. I just thought, oh boy, just
Don't change
don't
the
don't
menu.
eliminate some of the wonderful things that come from this beautiful syncretism of like
Mm,
Eastern culture and Western culture. This
mm.
particular food,
Don't
it's such a
don't change the recipes, please.
don't change the recipe. It's like when you go to a temple and they decide that they're going to feed you the vegan version of it, and you're like, oh damn it, don't give me tofu instead of paneer. But anyways, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Anyhow, so many topics we can talk with you, Alberto, but I like to conclude on this particular topic, which somehow I don't know if will be the main one. All of them are the main ones. But for those who are just entering or listening to this conversation, haven't heard some parts of it in the beginning, you may be thinking, how is this Franciscan guy know so much about Gaudiya Vaishnavism if you didn't hear all the conversation? And again, the fact is that, as we mentioned, you have been part of the tradition for a few decades. You have been baptized first, then baptized again, as you just mentioned, then connected with Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and then returned to your Christian baptism. So I'd like to ask you why you quote unquote left, if there's that's a word, or we can use another word, whatever
That's
word is
fair.
more comfortable. But why you left Christianity in the first place and joined Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and then why you left again, quote unquote. I don't want to sound like left. We already talked about the still present influence of all these traditions together, but why you left quote unquote Christianity and joined Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and one then you returned to Christianity and do not identify as a Gaudiya practitioner nowadays. What happened in between? And again, this is a long conversation. It could be a separate episode, but at least something you can share. So we can. I mean, for me, this also is. I'm sure you will say some. There will be some hopefully constructive criticism to some situations you have seen or situations that misrepresented the original ideal in through the practitioners. And I know that some of these things are even uncomfortable for people to hear about. But
Yeah.
I'm convinced that we need to have the integrity to address these uncomfortable conversations. And probably if they feel uncomfortable, that in itself signals that we may need to talk about it. So,
Well, and it's good for a person like me to do it because being a little bit more removed from the community, then I don't have to, it gives me a
mhm,
little bit of freedom to do that without necessarily having to suffer too many consequences from within the community
mhm,
itself, right?
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I mean, and again, I'm just going to kind of give a snapshot of it because, the details may not be super important, super interesting to everybody. Um, but my initial I was baptized as a baby, and then the baptistry baptized me because that's their practice. They don't consider baby baptism valid because you
Mm,
have to have some faith. And so I was baptized as a faithful person, as a teenager at the age of 15. but my period of time actively involved in Christianity was probably just a year.
Mm-hmm.
And because as I was realizing at the time that I was gay, a gay man, and there was absolutely no room for that
Mm.
in that branch of Christianity in which I found myself. I was young, and I mean, I was never simple-minded, but I was, I had simple, I wasn't very nuanced. So what I concluded at the time was, there's no room for me here
Mm.
to be who I am, and I can't help who I am.
Mm.
So that I was pretty sure of. So maybe there's just no room for me in Christianity, right? And
Mm.
so those were just kind of the broad threads
Yeah.
of thought that happened to me with a very short time. And for my survival, because I was getting so much um, assaulted with so much shame from
Mm.
that community very, very quickly, for my own survival, and I mean that quite literally, I had to withdraw, and I left Christianity with the conclusion that there was no room for me.
Yeah.
When I encountered, and I became kind of mostly kind of fed up with the idea of God. I wouldn't say I was an atheist as much as I was fed up with God topics because they seem to always bring in so much yuckiness that I just thought like, maybe better none of this is for me. But my interest never went away because I I encountered the devotees then at the age of 19, several years later, and it was just all so beautiful. It was also like rich and different and exotic and beautiful and deep. And I was just, the art was just so beautiful. The food, as I just shared, was, I thought maybe here there's a place for me.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there is some kind of God pockets where I'm allowed to kind of exist as who I am, only to find out, of course, that here I was involved in this institution called the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which was at the time not what it is now, even in terms of LGBT,
Mm-hmm.
issues. A friend of mine, Amara Das, was able to very, very hopefully expand the community's thinking on these topics. But before then, it was not much different than it would have been in a conservative Christian community
Mm.
as well. So I was like, well, damn it, here I find myself again interested in God and not a lot of room for me. And then I encountered Swami Tripurari, who
Mm-hmm.
I encountered him, but because he had said things about LGBT people in an
Mm-hmm.
inclusive way.
Yeah.
I don't know if most people know that he himself, his brother, is a gay man,
Mm.
um, and so he had a very kind of long kind of history himself with this topic, and maybe some more comfort with LGBT people, and he was more accepting at the time, and became, I think, more accepting even than that over years. Already had some LGBT disciples, so I joined him, and I left ISKCON at the time to join him, and in there, the topic of sexuality really went away. And I was allowed to just kind of pursue God, which is what the whole point was to begin with.
Mm.
It was so ironic that so much of the energy in my pursuit of
Mm.
God was dedicated to questions of who I was sexually,
Mm.
because it was really a distraction
Yeah.
from what I really wanted to do, which was I just kind of wanted to know what God was like and enter into relationship there. And that's what I was being called to. So, anyways, with Swami Tripurari's group, I was able to do that. The question of sexuality just went away. And for very many years, I was able to get involved in that very deeply. He himself is a very deep man and a very philosophical man, which I liked because if people would listen to me, they could tell that I tend to be a little philosophical too. And I
Mm.
really enjoyed that. And so I entered that path very, very fully within a few years. And I stayed there for quite a long time. But then, since you're asking the question of leaving, and there is a leaving in it, it's not an entire leaving. It's not like like I've you know disregard what do you call it? I've never kind of omitted that from my mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Only to lobotomize me from all that stuff, right? But I there was a leaving, and the leaving was, in waves. It developed in waves. The first wave of that, and the most philosophical slash theological, was simply the idea of Krishna. I love the idea of Krishna. I love the imagery of Krishna. I love the stories of Krishna. When I joined, I didn't know that it was going to be quite that concrete,
Mm-hmm.
where God's ultimate highest personality was going to be literally as, a young Indian boy
Mm.
uh, in a pastime doing these very Indian things, but in eternity. And
Mm-hmm.
as much as I love a lot of that, I was longing personally for something a little bit broader,
Mm-hmm.
not so. It's not a criticism of the more narrow kind of potential that comes with loving God in one particular way. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
beautiful. But I was kind of longing for something a little bit maybe different.
Mm-hmm.
And Chaitanya's ecstasy, as I said before, was very drawing, but I wasn't drawn to kind of a Gopi Bhav kind of
Mm-hmm.
love for Krishna. Maybe a little bit more Sakya Bhav stuff, as Swami Tripurari's group would have been
Mm-hmm.
interested in. Maybe not quite that either, because I wasn't really drawn to the Krishna Leela in the way that I felt like I was supposed to be. I really felt like I was supposed to really, 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 really like all this stuff, and I better love cows, right? And mostly I just had kind of unpleasant experiences with cows where Bhumi over at Adarya had just kind of shoved me around the barn and thrown me across the room. And I just wasn't a cow lover either. And I just was looking for something a little different and a conception of God that was not that conception in particular, but I loved all the mystical,
Mm-hmm.
profound mystical thinking. So that was in the background of all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was just a whole lot of institutional stuff.
Mm. Okay.
Um, I was aware, and this is not something that I'm not really picking on Sri Chaitanya Sangha, to be honest with you here,
Yeah.
because I could
Yeah,
easily,
I would like to clarify because, of course, as most of you know, I was also part of Sri Chaitanya Sangha. I was also a student of Tripura Swami, and for different reasons that most of you know, there has been some distance there. So it's not here that we are organizing with Alberto here some online
no, it's not a
Bible
coup.
schooling or anything, because as you can see, and hopefully you can feel from both of us, we have our gratitude, our appreciation, our indebtedness from what we
Yeah.
have received from both Swami Tripurari and his Sangha. We may have our differences and distance from different from each other, but just making that clear that one thing that doesn't do away with the other, so to say. So I want just
Yeah.
to clarify that for
Thank
myself
you.
also, but
V-
please continue.
Very, very good disclaimer. No, because I could easily say the same thing about what I
Mm-hmm.
saw in ISKCON, and I could also say the same thing for what I see sometimes in many of
Yeah,
the Christian communities that I'm in. It's
yeah.
kind of uh, a disappointment I feel, and it might be my own fault for having maybe over idealized what faith communities should be like, and maybe I'm always holding up an ideal that's unrealistic, and so that's
Mm-hmm.
on me, right? But nevertheless, I will say that a kind of a constant discouragement with what spiritual communities end up being like. And
Mm-hmm.
since I always look for the fruits, as we talked about in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
I was just being aware that I wasn't seeing spiritual communities bearing the kind of fruit I expected them to bear.
Okay.
I wasn't often finding spiritual practitioners becoming better people. I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't seeing myself necessarily becoming a better person. So that fruit was kind of lacking. My humanity was not improving. I wasn't kinder. I wasn't gentler. I wasn't more compassionate. I wasn't feeling encouraged even to cultivate that. Um, Although Shikshashtakam addresses some of those
Mm-hmm.
things specifically. Right?
Mm-hmm.
But I also felt like the communities weren't really loving each other particularly well. And again, that doesn't just apply to Sri Chaitanya Sangha, it applies to ISKCON, it applies to Christian communities as well. Although sometimes in Christianity you can see some improvements on that, but nevertheless still deficient in my opinion. How do we love each other? And shouldn't that be a natural part of all of this? Whatever your theological aspiration,
Yeah.
shouldn't deeply loving each other and caring each other for each other be a first principle
Yeah.
of what spiritual community has to include? And it almost felt like I often heard things and I'm paraphrasing, like a yeah, 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 sure, that sounds important, but there was never any conviction about it. I
Mm-hmm.
remember there was just a time where I wanted to create kind of a call tree. Do you know what a call tree is? It's where kind of like a phone tree where you basically create a list of like all the people in your community network, and you create a protocol for who calls who, so that there's continuous contact or effective communication in an emergency or something like that, right?
Okay. Okay.
A phone tree, call tree, anyways. And so I said, I just want to create something like this where we all commit to calling each other
Mm-hmm.
every certain amount of time, because otherwise we don't hear from each other sometimes for years. And
Mm-hmm.
just to ask each other, how are you doing? But
Mm-hmm.
in a systematic way, to show everybody that we care enough to systematize checking in with each other to make sure it never falls away.
Mm-hmm.
And I was surprised by how much resistance there was to the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I've encountered that again in other places too. This idea that we should systematically care for each other. Oh, it's so artificial then, shouldn't it be natural? Well, no, it should be natural and it should be systematic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so eventually I just started feeling like there wasn't a lot of emotional and relational support in those in the community for life struggles. And I remember at another point I had had a child, right? And then after I had had a child, I had had a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that maybe one person had ever even asked me about any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody was curious, really. I can't say nobody was curious. It's really unfair of me, but I didn't hear any curiosity. And it wasn't the first time that that had happened where people felt like, wait, is my life important here at all? And anyway, so that combined with the more theological concerns I had just really didn't make a lot of sense for me to continue. But also, as you heard, I was so in love with the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I was so in love with the theology and the mysticism and the power of it that it was hard. It was very, very hard. I
Can imagine.
experienced deep, deep grief and very, very alone. My best friend had left some years ago from the same community also for her own reasons. Um, but um, I was able to share some of this with her and some other people who had left also, but it felt like a very solitary grief to have
Mm-hmm.
something so important um, go away. And I didn't want to lose it all. But
Mm-hmm.
like with any other death or grief, some things always stay that were very profound and beautiful and spiritual. And I think that's how it's been for me. And then there's, things like this, right? I have a friend, Jai Jagannath, who I know you know, who invited me to speak one time on something.
He's
And
coming. He's coming today here where I am now at Michigan today. So he's coming in a few hours, and we'll be facilitating a retreat this weekend. So
send him my love. Yeah. And
yeah.
then you who are engaging me now. And so it feels almost like
Mm.
a full circle, right? Where I could still be who I am and pursue my spiritual aspiration following the way of Christ. And, um, and still be in deep relationship with the people who clearly should matter to me because we have, similar love and have been
Mhm.
influenced by similar loves and by God in similar ways. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for such a journey. And I know it was like a summarized version of the timeline, but pretty accurate and substantial. And yeah, you have my empathy. And of course, you were telling your journey, and I couldn't avoid connect with some points in my own
of course,
way. And again, not with this, we are not pointing to any particular group nor person, because these are kind of common patterns in humanity, and we are not free from them either. And hopefully, we
sure.
can also take
But
us.
it did happen to me in that group. Like,
Yeah,
I want to also say that um, Srila Sridhar Maharaj is paraphrased as having said something like, "New people in the front door and old people out the back door. This is the farce of preaching," right, or
Mm,
something like that. And
mhm,
I, over the 15 to 17 years that I was kind of very acquainted with that particular group, but it's not just that particular group. I saw a lot of people come and go, and once they went, they were just gone.
mm,
And I would always think, well, wait, they can't just be gone. We still
mm,
love them, right?
mm,
Right? I still loved those people,
mm.
right? And so, some very, very dear friends of mine left at some point, and I was very, very hurt by that. Um, and um, and I just think that we have to be really thoughtful about that. Now, again, just so we could be honest in saying that we're not picking on any one group, I find it happening all the time, even in my current tradition, where it's like you get so excited when new people come, but when
Yeah.
old people leave, you're like, okay, God bless them, and it's like, oh, wait, even if they're not part of our group, we still love them, right? We have to kind of now we have to preserve that relationship because we entered into it. and it's
mm,
permanent, right?
mm,
So, anyways, it's this the enthusiasm of the new, of the
mm,
novel,
mm.
and then the longing to dissociate ourselves from the old
Mm.
and the past,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which,
And even if someone, as you mentioned, gets distance from one's lineage or tradition, but we have a connection with that person, the challenge is okay, I like to continue that relationship, but now it's with a different setting, with a different scenario, because that person is no longer connected with my tradition, but nonetheless
mm,
I love the individual, so it's
yeah,
challenging
that's right.
for me to enter into that space to somehow rediscover the relationship, rediscover the person, rediscover myself in the relationship. But I
Mhm.
will argue that all of that helps us to become more and more human and more spiritual in that connection.
Yeah,
And that's why I appreciate many of your words, which again are not pointing to, even though they happen in our particular case, in particular groups with particular people, we know that these dynamics happen in other places. But at the end of the day, for me, it has a lot to do with, yeah,
yeah,
not dismissing our humanity and trying to integrate humanity with lofty theological concepts, because if not we can become intellectually expert, so to say, but also neglecting or dysfunctional in some foundational basic level.
yeah,
And at least in our tradition, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, is the two of them have to go so together, because we will talk in terms of the Nara Lila, or the human pastimes of Krishna, which for me is fully human and fully divine. In your tradition, you may talk about Christ as fully human, fully divine in your own way. So there is no way out of becoming fully human ourselves if we want to access that realm, no? So
that's right.
yeah.
And the interest. So I've told Swami Tripurari very clearly, for example, that I really love him and will always love him, and I believe in him,
Mm-hmm.
despite all my challenges. But the interesting thing there is that he had a friend who used to be a Prabhupada disciple, who left and became a nun, a
Mm-hmm.
woman,
Mm-hmm.
and he stayed friends with her for years and years. And while I have not myself been able to establish a kind of a friendship with Swami since my departure, I kind of have a sense that's possible, because
Mm-hmm.
he did have a particular affection for me, and that I felt it, and I for him, and I think he felt it too. And I think there is hope even in these relationships that seem so fraught sometimes, that
Mm-hmm.
we all have, where there can be healing. And I think that's an important thing. I talked to Bhakti Rasa, a part of your association, about these kinds of things before too. The idea that there's always still a chance to repair relationships.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a very important thing to say. Or as Mr. Fred Rogers said,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, you could always stop what you're doing and go back and do the right thing again.
Mm.
And I believe that we all can still make an intentional effort to repair relationships that have ruptured.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth it
Yeah.
for us to do that, even if the new relationship will be different than the previous one
Mm-hmm.
was, because we could nourish each other now in more nuanced and complex ways.
Yeah. Or even if you know that and want that and try that, and it doesn't to be working because from one side or the other, the moment is not there yet, or for whatever reason, not to judge anyone, at least to, if you know, okay, there's a need for distance for the time being, at least to keep in your heart the door open for that. The possibility, as you say, the hope that every and any relationship can be healed, can be changed, can be transformed, can be reborn in its own way. So at least to have that openness, not to, that's a way of keeping hope in humanity. You ultimately, even
Yes.
if for the time being, it's not the moment now. I've tried, there has been no reply, there has been, I don't
Yeah.
know, unwillingness. Okay, and not becoming resentful, not becoming cynical, keeping healthy distance, but keeping the door and the hope open. If that has to happen, also not becoming overtly attached that it has to happen at one point, and even in
Mm,
this way and in that way, and keeping
yeah.
your life waiting on that, depending on that situation to happen that may not happen also, but at least having that foundational hope. Yeah, I totally agree with
Yeah.
that.
And to highlight one last little thing about that, which is the exercise of trying to reconcile,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's ineffective in the desired outcome of full reconciliation. The effort to reconcile heals us
Yeah.
and grows us. And we are nourished by if we make it part of our pattern to always try to reconcile,
Mm.
then we end up, in a patterned way, matured
Yeah.
by a tendency to reconcile, a tendency to want to bring together again, a, a willingness to admit our own faults and our own shortcomings that
Mhm.
contributed to the rupture in the relationship as well,
Mhm.
right? Because
Mhm.
I'm not free of fault here, as one of my god brothers would probably tell me very, very readily, of all the things that I did wrong to
Mm.
kind of not preserve to some of these relationships.
Mm.
I'm sure he's right.
Mm.
Right, and so that would grow me also if I were to continuously strive to make an effort. I had a client, and a spiritual direction client, who used to had kind of given up on some of his family relationships that had been quite fraught, and for very good reason, and it was a real hurt for this person. But I said, keep writing the letters,
Mhm.
even if you know they're being discarded. I think eventually just knowing that you're still writing them will soften people's hearts. If
Mm.
not, it's an exercise for you to
Mhm.
continuously be sending out your love and well wishes and desire for reconciliation.
Hmm. Amen.
Mm.
Thanks, brother. Thanks for sharing. And we are almost reaching 2 hours, so we will be wrapping up here today because also have some things to do as well as you, probably everyone. But it has been for me a beautiful conversation. It has been
Me
an
too.
honor, and actually, it's our first meeting in 2D. We have been talking audio and text messages for years, but first time we are seeing each other face to face in video. Hopefully, next time from 2D to 3D, and so on and so forth, and further dimensions as well. But
Next year in Mayapur.
yes, that sounded like prophetic. So I embrace the prophecy. Why not? Thank you. Let's arrange that. Let's see what happens. Yeah. You already threw the words to the ether, so something will start unfolding for sure. So before we conclude, Brother Alberto, something else you may like to, a few words of closing, any other thoughts you may like to share before we conclude?
No, I'm just want to say that I'm grateful. I rarely asked about these things with anyone, and you persisted in asking me to talk about them a little bit with you, and I really, really appreciate that, because it touches my heart and it heals a cynical part of me that says that no
Mm.
one's ever going to be interested in hearing what you have to say or what
Mm.
your experiences were. And so, for me, this has been an honor and also a healing moment. So
Beautiful.
thank
Thanks
you.
so much. And it has been healing for me, and I'm sure it has been learning experience for many of us. So yeah, we are very interested in what you have to tell us. And thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And once again, I'm sharing the email of Brother Alberto for those who would like to contact him. It's aevarona@gmail.com. So again, thank you so much to all of you for connecting today. Thank you so much, Brother Alberto, and we'll see each other again in the next 2 weeks, in 2 weeks more, for our next episode of the Free Radical podcast.
Thank you all. God bless you all.